Hey, everybody, welcome back to a brand new episode of Mikeadelic. I'm your host, Mike Brancatelli. Thank you for joining us today. We have a great episode for you. We have John Perkins, author of the New York Times bestselling book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, and also New York Times bestselling updated version of that book, The New Confessions of an Economic Hitman. You have to read this book. This is required reading. This is one of my favorite books of all time, and definitely one of the most eye-opening, compelling, gripping books I've ever read. A real page turner. I didn't want to put it down. I'm so glad that John updated the book from the New Confessions of an Economic Hitman, which has 15 new chapters, and the expanded editions. The expanded edition of this book, brings the story of the economic hitmen, the EHMs, up to date, and very chillingly home to the U.S. And over 40% of the book is new. So this updated version is well worth it to go get it. Don't even get the original version, as John says, just get the new one. And he's, like I said, 15 new chapters, including chapters identifying today's strategies being used with the economic hitmen, and just detailed documentation. The first edition was published in 2004, and I believe it spent 73 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list and sold well over 1 million copies. It's been translated into 32 languages. I mean, this was like a nuclear bomb went off when this book was dropped, and ever since then, John has been traveling around the world and giving talks and writing. And he's got all that. He's got so much information online. You can go and check out his website at johnperkins.org, where he has events and trips and speaking and articles that he writes. And you can also go on YouTube and check out. He has TED Talks, and he has all kinds of great information about all of this stuff that's going on that most people don't really know about so much. Most people are unaware of how these things work, how the world works, how government, corporations, and the deep state and
Yeah, well, like I said, I mean, when I picked up the book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, and read that, much like I'm sure you've heard from many people, it was an eye-opening experience. It was an awakening experience, is really what it is. And, I really need to commend you and honor you and praise you for your tremendous courage and bravery to come forth, speak up and speak out, and to write that book, and then to go on, of course, with having so much success with that book, and I'm sure influencing a lot more people that are doing amazing things now, and then to continue the work that you do with several other books, and the writing that you do, and the speaking that you do. So thank you, sir. Thank you, John Perkins, for being on the show, for being on my podcast, Mikeadelic, today, and for communicating with my audience about your message and sharing a little bit of your story. Thank you, sir.
Well, you're welcome, Mike. And I have to say, it is definitely my pleasure. I enjoy doing this. I'm sorry the world is in the condition it's in, but since it is, this is a good time to be alive and work on changing it. And I appreciate the podcast you're doing and all the information you're bringing to people. Thank you.
Yeah, there's an old Chinese proverb that says, "May you live in interesting times," and I think that we certainly do live in interesting times. And there's a lot that's happening in the world today, and there's been a lot happening in the world, ever since you released that book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman. So for the people that don't really know what the book is about, first of all, I of course recommend getting the book. It's an eye-opening book. It's a gripping, compelling book. So go and get that, and because it kind of all started with that. Is that right?
Well, yeah, I'd written 5 books before that, but they were on Indigenous cultures, which is another love of my life, and I spent a lot of time. I take groups to work with and live with and study with shamans in Colombia every year, and also the Mayan shamans in Guatemala every year, and also to the Amazon. And if people want to join me, they can go to my website, johnperkins.org, and find out about those trips. So I have this deep love of Indigenous people. I was a Peace Corps volunteer in the Amazon many years ago, and I've kept that. So I'd written 5 books on those cultures. And then after 9/11, knew that I had to expose what I understood about a system that's become so pervasive around the world, a real empire, which is not to condone anything that happened at 9/11, but to say that motivated me to tell all about this other side of my life, that's the economic hitman side. And I also want to say, Mike, that in the past year, I've come out with another book published by the same publisher as Confessions, called The New Confessions of an Economic Hitman, which goes a lot deeper into many of those things and brings it up to date. Confessions of an Economic Hitman was published 12 years ago. This one's 12 years later, and it really outlines a strategy for how to turn this around. So I would encourage your listeners not to buy Confessions of an Economic Hitman, buy the New Confessions of an Economic Hitman, because it has most of what was in the old one, plus a lot more and things that have been updated.
Oh, okay. Yeah, great. That's definitely a good suggestion, because that's totally what we want to focus on today, is some of those, I believe it's 15 new chapters that you added to that book, and where it's focusing on the solutions, right? Because where Economic Hitman was such a great, gripping, compelling New York Times bestselling book, that this new one is probably the one that you want to get with, that offers the solution, the path forward. That's fantastic. And I've heard you talk about your experience with the Peace Corps in the Amazon and getting sick, and how a shaman healed you. I've heard that story a few times. I've heard you tell that. And yeah, so I guess that might be a good place to start, actually, is around that time. So I'm wondering, because on this show we explore those realms, the mystical, the shamanistic realms, the realms sometimes that psychedelics can provide to you, also the realms of meditation, where we're going inward and discovering ourselves on our inner journey. And I know that you recently have also written some fantastic articles, one of them being titled "You as the Creator." I think a couple months ago, was published on johnperkins.org. So with that being said, this experience in the Amazon with the shaman, what did that provide for you? I mean, other than saving your life, I mean that definitely had something to do with it. But what was it about that kind of struggle and stuff that gave you a kind of a different vision or a different perspective?
Yeah, it actually changed my life totally, and my perspective on the world in a way. I graduated from business school. I'd gone in the Peace Corps, and find myself deep in the Amazon, living with the Shuar people, who were hunters and gatherers, very traditional lives, warriors also. They were still conducting some of their intertribal warfare. And I got very, very sick. Um, I was dying. I couldn't keep any food down. I lost a tremendous amount of weight, and I couldn't really get out. It was a 2-day walk through dense jungle to the nearest dirt road, where you might catch a rickety old bus that would take another 2 days to get me to the closest city where there were medical facilities. There was no way I could do that. I was too weak and too sick, resigned to dying. And then this shaman performed a healing on me, and one night took me on this shamanic journey. And during this journey, what I saw was that I'd grown up from a family that goes back over 300 years in New England, New Hampshire, Vermont, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and very traditional foods. We washed our hands a lot, very hygienic. We ate meat and potatoes and nothing very interesting. And suddenly I'm with people who've never seen a bar of soap and who eat some very, very strange foods, in my opinion, including something called chicha that they drink. It's a kind of beer,
Mm.
and it's made out of women chewing manioc root and spitting it. It ferments into a kind of beer, and
Delicious.
yeah, well, it actually is if you get used to it, and you mix it with water to drink, because what they know, what all Amazonian people know, is that the rivers have a lot of organic matter in them. You cannot drink water in the Amazon unless you mix it with something like chicha, or something that's alcoholic, that kills the bacteria. They don't know about bacteria, but they knew that worked. And so I'm drinking a lot of chicha because you got to hydrate a lot in the tropics. and eating squirming white grubs and other foods that they consider delicacies, but to me were very weird. On the shamanic journey, I saw that every time I ate these foods or drank this chicha, I heard a voice saying, "Son, it'll kill you," but probably my mother. At the same time, I saw how incredibly healthy the schwa are, or were and are still. Um, the men are built like Tarzan. They're hunters and gatherers. They carry heavy dead animals out of the forest.
Mm.
The women, well, I was in my early 20s. The women were looking very good. They were quite. It was anyway.
I bet. Yeah.
And so on this shamanic journey, what I came to understand in one night was that the food and drink were not killing me. These were healthy foods and drinks, very organic, very nutritious. It was my mindset. It was this voice telling me that they would kill me. I understood that so deeply. And the next morning, I woke up and I was totally healthy. The shaman then later required as payment for this that I become his apprentice. And I have to tell you, this was a long time ago. There was no future in shamanism then. There is now. But in those days, I graduated from business school. I saw no future in it at all. I had no desire to go through the rather rigorous training of a shaman. But the guide saved my life. So I did it. And I became very enthralled with it. And later also studied with shamans up in the Andes, in the Quechua shamans, and later in Persia, Iran, what we know as Iran, in Egypt and Indonesia, and many other places, Guatemala with the Mayans, and on and on. And everywhere I studied with shamans, I discovered they had the same concept that human life reality is molded by our perception. And that's what happened to me. So we could say there was an objective reality. That was the food and chicha that I was eating and drinking. I had a perception that it was killing me. So my reality became that it was killing me. Once I changed that perception and understood and really got it into my system that this food was good for me, everything changed.
Mm.
And I found this is the key to shamanism around the world. It's also the key to psychotherapy, to quantum physics, to philosophy. We know that there really is no such thing as the United States, Canada, Mexico, Russia, China. There's no such thing as corporations or an economy except as we perceive them. And once enough people perceive something or codify it into law, it becomes objective reality. And that's really the key now to understanding that we have an objective reality of an Earth with amazing natural and human resources and all kinds of resources. We have a perceived reality that says that corporations have to exploit these and maximize profits, regardless of the social and environmental costs. And that's created an economic system that today is failing us. It's consuming itself into extinction. So all we have to do is change the perception. It's not about maximizing profits. It's about making a decent rate of return for investors who invest in things that will create what I call a life economy, an economy that is itself a renewable resource, that's sustainable, that's truly sustainable, and that truly enhances all life on this planet. It's all about perception, Mike.
Right. Yes. So it's this giving system rather than this taking system. And I have to say, it sounds like to me that you are a shaman. I mean, you sound like you are a modern day shaman, somebody that we can understand in our context of writing and appearing on shows like this and giving talks that you give and the work that you do. In my understanding of things, usually a shaman is somebody that goes through a difficult ordeal and is able to kind of go through hell and back again or so and come out on the other side. And sounds like that you did that literally, on the verge of death and then back and rebirth and reborn to shed light on an important issue, because in a way, we're organisms and we live in this organism. I've heard you say that, we're in this kind of living space shuttle, this thing that you put so eloquently in your talk. And it's like, yeah, I mean, much the same way that we're doing things that could potentially kill us or make us sick, we're doing the same thing to the planet. And if we are able to kind of heal ourselves on an individual level, then we could probably do that on a collective level. And yeah, I want to talk about this more, because you're writing with the power of the perceptions to alter our reality, and that theme, I think, is everything. And so if you could just talk a little bit more about some of those things, like maybe we could start with you know, I guess kind of understanding that we have a choice, right? When it comes down to these things, in terms of believing in these corporations and stuff like that, that we all have a kind of choices to make, and we can kind of make our voice heard. I've heard you talk a lot about that and write about that. What are some ways that we can go about, doing that, and to try and make some real change in this world that a lot of us find is kind of shitty?
Well, let's start, Mike. I think the fact is that we know that we've created a global economic, and it's really more than economic, it's political and social system that just isn't working. The glaciers are melting, there's no question. The oceans are rising, there's climate change, species are going extinct at horrendous rates, on and on and on. We know that this system's failing us. We know that our economy is based on consuming resources that are limited, or that, like oil, even if it's enough of it, burning it is polluting the atmosphere so much it's going to destroy us. We know this, and we also know that this is being caused by big corporations, much more than governments. That governments are run by corporations, and we've known this for a long time. It's true in China, it's true in Russia, it's certainly true here. Perhaps the greatest gift that Trump has given us is to make this very, very manifest. It's very obvious under the Trump administration.
Right.
It should have.
Yeah, you wrote about that in the Trump as a shadow, like all these shadow elements are now coming out, and it's kind of forcing us to recognize, right?
Yeah, and it was true under Obama, whose financial policies were run basically by Goldman Sachs and other Wall Street insiders
Right.
who were on his cabinet. It was true under Clinton. It was certainly the Bushes, both came out of big oil. So it's been true for a long time, but Trump has made it very, very manifest, brought it out into the open, because he's still so involved in making profits off businesses that probably gained from his personal connections as a president. In any case, we know we've created this system, and it's based in big corporations. And we also know that big corporations are just groups of people. But something significant happened in 1976 that changed everything. It changed perception. It created, in a way, it created the problems we have today. They've been growing up until then, but they really hit. So let me just say that before 1976, when I was a student in business school, I was taught that a good CEO makes a decent rate of return for investors, but also takes good care of his employees, healthcare and pension funds, et cetera, takes good care of his customers and in the communities where his business is involved. Not only does a good CEO require that his corporation pay taxes, imagine that, but also contributes money to local school systems and recreational facilities and things like that in the community where the corporation is working, is deeply involved. And that's what I was taught. In 1976, that all changed when Milton Friedman won the Nobel Prize in economics. And amongst other things, Friedman's probably his most significant statement was that the only responsibility of business is to maximize shareholder profits, regardless of the social and environmental costs. That's not what I've been taught. That changed everything. It didn't just come from it. It didn't been a growing consensus. An author named Hayek, who was part of the Austrian School of Economics, had brought this up before. But Friedman really, really get it out there. And immediately Reagan and Thatcher bought into it. And every U.S. and every major president and prime minister around the world has bought into this ever since. And it is the single thing that's created this insane economic system that we have, something I call a death economy. Mm-hmm. That's based on militarization, for one thing, huge budgets spent on war, killing people or threatening to kill them, and on destroying the earth, killing the very resources upon which we all depend. It's a death economy. But it's based on this perception that the job of business is to maximize profits, regardless of all the other costs. And we need to change that perception in order to create what I call a life economy that will be based on cleaning up pollution, mining all the plastic that's out there in the ocean, also mining all the oil that's leaked out of every oil development site in the world and most gas stations in the world, and cleaning up pollution of all kinds, regenerating destroyed environments, new technologies that recycle, that even have a much greater use of the sun and the air, and make better use of the water. Uh, Technologies that create a whole new system for transportation, communications, energy, banking, everything. Things that do not destroy the earth, but recycle, reuse, and come up with new methods. It's a very, very exciting time to create this new economy, and it's happening. We need to make it happen faster.
Yeah, definitely. It is happening. And I think the more and more people getting exposed to new ideas, different ideas, thinking outside the box, and like you said, engaging in more of a life economy rather than the kind of old model, the death economy, which is really, it's like a distorted system. It's something that I think, a lot of has to do with these central bankers, and obviously you have experience with this with working as an economic hitman. The arranging these loans and the debt, and the Federal Reserve printing money and the inflation rates going up, and this cycle that kind of keeps people dependent and in debt, and nobody says no. It's easy to for people to get corrupted because we have this system of money where we need to have money, and it's easy and people are attached to it. So it's almost like we have this kind of like foreign distorted thing happening where these systems just make, we can't keep them in check, or they're just run amok and they're out of control. So with all the things that have been going on, and like you said, 9/11 was a catalyst for you, and I remember that time, and I remember people getting active and involved, but it seems like now with Trump back, and maybe some people are waking up a little bit more, but really this has been consistent, and this kind of global empire building is getting bigger and bigger. And so when we talk about kind of us being responsible and having like the power to do something to change this, what are some other like ways in which people can stay informed, or kind of connect with other people? I mean, social media seems to be really good at organizing and getting people together. Uh, but are there other kinds of alternative ways that you find that are successful for getting this message out there?
Well, I think, Mike, first of all, we have to understand that corporations run the world, and yet they are totally dependent on you and your listeners and me to support them, to buy their goods and services, to invest in them, to work for them, to get government policies that help them. It's our job. And I think it's important to recognize that I'm not sure that our political system is a democracy anymore, but the marketplace is, if we'll just use it as such.
Right.
We the consumers, the employees, and so on, have tremendous power. I remember when I was in college, there was apartheid in South Africa, and the rivers in this country were on fire with pollution. Some of them just terribly polluted, including the Charles River in Boston where I went to school. And we get corporations to clean these up. We get them to open their doors wider to women and minorities. We have tremendous power. And every corporate executive knows about Bear Stearns going out of business, Eastern Airlines going out of business, Woolworths, Polaroid, Kodak. The list is huge of corporations that have gone out of business because they did not respond to their customers, or they had poor management policies. Every CEO knows this.
Mhm.
And I speak at a lot of CEO conventions, business conventions, where there are a lot of CEOs, and I hang out with these people. I know a lot of these people, and they're very frustrated. A typical example is a CEO who told me, I want my company to be greener. I want to pay our workers a fair wage, or I want to clean up the pollution, but I'm afraid it might cost me in the short run half a percentage of market share, and my primary investors, my big stockholders, will fire me and replace me with someone who only cares about market share. And so what they say is, for heaven's sakes, get my customers to insist that I do the right thing. And so, my advice to your listeners, to all of us, is to pick a corporation that you would like to see change. It could be Monsanto. That seems to be public enemy number one, or Exxon, or Nike, or Kmart, Walmart, whatever it is. And once a week, send them an email, and try not to make them a bad guy. Try to say something like, I like your product. You might not want to say this about Monsanto, but all the others. I like your product. I love your product. I want to buy your product, but I won't buy it anymore until you clean up the pollution you caused, or pay your workers a fair wage, or something along these lines. And to Monsanto, you can say, I'm not going to buy any products that have Monsanto in them until you start producing seeds that poor people can use without the huge toxic the use of toxic fertilizers and insecticides, etc. Make something that truly is good for the world. If every one of your listeners picks a company and sends an email once a week saying something like that, I want to help you, company, but you got to do the right thing. You got to create a life economy.
Right.
And also send it to all your social networking circles. Ask them to send it to the company and to all their social networking circles. And these executives have told me, if I have 100,000 emails like that, I can then go to my top stockholders and say, hey, we've got to change, or we're going to go out of business, just like Woolworths did, or whatever company, whatever field they happen to be in. We've got to change. And so what we have to recognize is the leverage point here is corporations. Yes, voting in political elections is important, but even more important, I think, is understanding that corporations have the power, and we can force corporations to change. And many of the executives out there are looking for us to force them to change.
Right. Yes, because these corporations do function, like you said, with Milton Friedman's comment on their only function is to maximize shares. It's like it's kind of like this entity that's been designed to have superiority over human beings and just trample human beings and we hear like for profit over people and things like that, when really their incentive should be to provide goods and services that we want to buy. So I think there is actually a chance at communicating with these kind of mega monolithic entities, sometimes even like Walmart or something like that. And no matter how big it is, I think getting people to get engaged and to voice their opinions and go out and put them out there would be important, because at the end of the day, these people are trying to make a profit and they are incentivized. So they do want to kind of give a little bit to the customers and make sure that they don't go out of business, like you're saying. Well, what do we do about the ones that are kind of, all embedded in this? I know something, a term that's come out recently that's been very popular, but something that I've been paying attention to for a long time, and something that you've shed light on, is kind of like this, the deep state is what they're calling it now. These agencies and these contract for hire, these jackals, as you put it, and this sorts of thing, crony bankers and, in bed with politicians and stuff. How do we really combat something like that? It seems like to me that and I've been thinking about this for a while, and it seems like to me that I think it's a two-pronged approach, and I want to see if you agree with me. And something like you said, kind of voicing our opinions, being active, but also kind of working on ourselves and altering our what do we allow and what do we not allow? What do we stand up for and what do we say, no, I won't take it anymore? I know you're a big fan of Thomas Paine, and so am I. It's like, when are we going to have people wake up and just demand change? That we're not gonna tolerate it on an individual level, and we're not going to tolerate it on a community level. So I don't know if there's really a question there, but if you want to expand on that a little bit, that'd be great.
Well, yeah, I think it's important that everybody look at their own self, look at your own perception, what I call a perception bridge that moves us from one objective reality to the other. So my perception bridge in the Amazon was, so the objective reality one was chicha, beer, and the foods I was eating. the bridge that took me to the bridge I crossed was that originally was that the perception that it was killing me. So that took me to the reality two, which was it was killing me. As soon as I changed that bridge, as soon as I crossed a different bridge, and you can envision this as a circle, reality one, and then a little bridge that goes over to another circle, reality two. As soon as I changed that bridge, that perception bridge, to this food is making me healthy, my reality changed. And I think every one of us can look at that. So if we are really, I'm really angry. I'll use myself as an example. It's different for everybody. I'm really angry. I've been angry for a long time. And I used to throw stones, go out and protest and get my head beat open by police.
Yeah.
and it really, I didn't do much good. It was very destructive and self-destructive. I'm still angry, but I'm having a hell of a good time with it. I'm writing books. I love writing. I just really love writing and talking to you. And I'm traveling all over the world. I'm headed to Russia in a couple of weeks to speak at a big event in St. Petersburg, and then on to Kazakhstan, and then Rome, and I speak, and I love this. It's exciting. I'm still really angry, but nobody would guess it. I'm having fun with it, and it isn't eating away at me anymore. It isn't threatening to cause a heart attack or cancer. So I would encourage every listener to look at what are the realities you're facing. My reality was I'm angry and I love to write. And once I cross that perception bridge that says I'm going to use my writing to deal with my anger, it took me to a new reality that's much saner and much more comfortable. Every listener can do that on a different level. We all have passions and we all have skills. So ask yourself, what are your passions? What are your skills? If you're a carpenter, how do you use that carpentry to create a life economy and to talk to all your clients and let them know that that's what you're doing? If you're a teacher or a plumber or a parent, what do you do individually? And then beyond that, each and every one of us can get involved in these consumer movements, like I mentioned, where you pick a company and you convince that company that it has to change. These people, like the jackals you talked about, who are out there, there's no question, but they're totally dependent on this system. They're totally dependent on these corporations buying into this idea that their goal is to maximize profits, regardless of the social and environmental costs. Once we change that, everything changes. There are sociopaths running corporations. I earlier mentioned executives who want to see their companies get better. There are some out there, there's no question, that don't give a damn. We saw them in Enron. We've seen them lots of places. But they're not driven by profit. They're driven by success. And as long as we define maximizing profits as the measurement of success, then that's what will drive them. But if we define success as being measured by how socially and environmentally good the company is, how much it's creating, how much it's participating in creating a life economy, suddenly everything changes. The sociopaths will be the first people to buy it on a big level.
Yeah, it seems so obvious, John. It seems like wow, like wouldn't we want to all work together to create a better life for everybody? So maybe people aren't as angry, and that we're a little happier, and that we're doing more good, and we're bringing more life, and those sorts of things. And I really like what you said about managing your anger, and it sounds like to me that you're channeling it. You're channeling your anger. You're using the power that comes along with that anger, that negative energy, and harnessing it to immensely productive works. I mean, mind-shattering, mind-blowing works that you're doing, and changing people's lives, inspiring people to do better. And so the approach that I respect so much that you're taking is this holistic approach. It's not necessarily just one thing. It's a whole compartment, a whole area of things. And so thank you for that. And I know a lot of people, and I used to be kind of firmly in this camp as well, that just thought, well, if we just kind of got rid of people's, if we just can convince people's belief system that maybe these big organizations like governments and religions and there's just these giant institutions, if people can just kind of stop giving them so much, putting so much faith into them, that maybe we could start to see things develop in a more local, kind of community-centric kind of way. But it seems like to me that the mainstream media these days is really, really, kind of on the offensive. It seems like the mainstream media is kind of against the people, and they're like selling fear. And I know that your first book, not your first book, but your first book in the series of the Confessions of an Economic Hitman books that came out, the one that made the New York Times bestseller list, wasn't even reviewed, right, by the New York Times until eventually they had to review it. So what is it like? What's going on with this media kind of web that we live in? This kind of, what seems like almost this omnipresent kind of weird Orwellian media world that we've created that kind of seems to get a lot of people trapped up in this kind of way of thinking.
You're talking about what's known as the mainstream media.
Yeah, right, exactly.
And it's owned by big corporations,
right,
or either outright ownership for the most part, or the few outlets that aren't are owned by their advertisers essentially. And so once again, the key to changing them is convincing the corporations that they've got to change, and they want to create a level playing field. So if the executive at one particular retail company, let's say Nike, decides that they want to pay their workers in Indonesia a lot more money, they also want to implement rules that'll make sure that Reebok does the same thing, and everybody else. So the key to all of this is through the corporations, and that's the key to the media too. But I also want to point out that what we're talking about here is what's known as the mainstream media. And actually, I think the mainstream media today is you. I think it's the internet. I think it's the blogs that I write and post on johnperkins.org and so many other people. The information's getting out there. There's no question.
Yeah.
As you pointed out, that my book was not reviewed in the New York Times. It was on their bestseller list for 73 weeks, and not reviewed by them. They never did review it. They finally wrote a major article, a feature article about the phenomena of the book. But despite the fact they didn't review it, it stayed on their bestseller list because of people like you, because of so many outlets that are not part of what we think of the mainstream media, but which are, I think, now becoming the mainstream media.
Yeah.
I don't buy. I've given up buying or even reading the New York Times, which I used to read, and the Wall Street Journal. I don't bother. Right. I don't watch any of the news channels on television. I do a lot on the internet. I love Amy Goodman, Democracy Now! I love what you're doing. There's a lot of information out there. And I like NPR radio. There's a lot, none of it's perfect. And we have to sift through it all. But more than anything else, we must not feel victimized. It's hear people saying, well, there's nothing we can do. The system's too big, it's too strong, or the reptilians have taken over, or whatever.
Have they?
And people say that.
Yeah.
And that's a sign of a victim. We're not victims. It's perception that we need to change. It's understanding that we have the power, that corporations are running the world, and we have the power to change that. And we must take on that responsibility and accept it. I mean, you talked about Tom Paine, who, during the Revolutionary War, had such a huge influence on changing people's perceptions. And this is a time when we need that again. It wasn't about saying, actually, in 1773, it was commonly believed throughout the colonies that the British were invincible, strongest army in the world. And then George Washington stood up before the Continental Congress, and he recalled a time 20 years earlier during the French and Indian War when he was at the Battle of the Monongahela, when a crack British army under one of its best generals, Braddock, huge army, was terribly defeated. Braddock himself was killed, as were many, many of his men, by a handful of Indians under the direction of a few French. And so Washington stood up before the Continental Congress and said, those British are not invincible. All we got to do is hide behind trees like the Indians. It's the perception.
Yeah.
And then Tom Paine started writing things, and Tom Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, and they took this to a new level, and then they got it out there. And so, Paine's these are the times that try men's souls, and some are patriot, and so on and so forth. And he says, and so we've got to take action. And that bit of that essay, which I've talked a lot about, as you said, in my blogs on johnperkins.org, people can go and look it up now, was read to every soldier in Valley Forge. Washington demanded it be read to every soldier. It was read to millions of people in bars, taverns, churches. People who couldn't read heard it throughout the land. It changed perception because, again, Washington had understood that the British were not invincible. They could be defeated. And Paine and other writers took this to another level and said, okay, get off your butts, do something. We're at one of those times now where we can no longer say we're the victims. The system's too powerful. It's entrenched. There's some awful force that's come down from Pleiades or someplace else that's controlling us. You know, people have always been tempted to say that there were forces outside themselves, but the fact of the matter is it's our perceptions that control each of us individually, and it's our perceptions that control us as societies.
Wow, yeah, it's these are the times that try men's souls, and you know, I'm such a fan of the work of Joseph Campbell, famous author and mythologist Joseph Campbell, who talks about the hero's journey and kind of you know, kind of that story and how that story has influenced and taken on many shapes. And one of them that, you know, I attach to very much. I'm a big Star Wars nerd. You know, I'm a big Star Wars fan. I love the series. I love the storytelling of good versus evil. And it seems like to me, it's like, you know, people will go and they'll watch these movies and they'll get all excited and they'll cheer for the heroes and the rebels and, you know, and against the big bad machines that are trying to crush us. But then in reality, it's kind of like, you know, a lot of people do kind of resign to the fact that maybe somebody else will do it or something like that. But I think really in the time that we live now, we're seeing more and more, and with the power of the internet, the power of blogs like yours and podcasts like mine, and you know, the kind of work that people are doing out there to connect and social media, there is this kind of sense of we can do this. And I know a past guest on the show that was talking about how, you know, if you had said to people, you know, in 1989 or whatever, that or it was like the day before, I think like March 10th, 1990, that the Soviet Union was going to fall, or 1991, whenever it fell. I don't know the exact date, but if you said the day before when the Soviet Union fell that it was going to fall, people would probably look at you like you were crazy. But these things do happen. Change does happen. And it gets there by spreading the message and doing the work, like you have been doing, what I'm trying to do now. So a quick question regarding, like, you know, with the corporations behaving in the way that they do, and you know, kind of leaning on government and government leaning on them. I wanted to get a little bit more of like your sense of where the role of the politicians play in this, because I really like the things that you have to say about this. I really like what I've read about how and what I've seen from you talk about with this revolving door of American politicians. It doesn't really matter who's in there. They all got ties to the big banks, big oil. I mean, for God's sake, we have Rex Tillerson. You know, they just put the oil guy right in there. They went straight to the source this time. So I'm wondering, is it like, you know, with that apparatus functioning the way it does, and so out in the open in the way that they're functioning now, with people kind of, you know, with the situation that we have now, how can you know, what's your take on that? Like, what's your take on the role of politics? Like, do you think we can should we limit the scope and size of the government? Should we limit the responsibilities that these politicians have? Or what would be a solution to try and maybe say, you know, because the corporations are kind of leaning on them, and you have experience with this as well, right? What's that? Can you explain a little bit further about that relationship, that kind of contractor and lobbyist kind of scheme that happens down there?
Well, yeah, Mike, you just covered a lot of territory there, and I want to go.
Yeah, sorry, I have a tendency to do that. My apologies.
I want to go back to your comment about Joseph Campbell
Sure.
and Star Wars and these kinds of things. Joseph Campbell, brilliant, and he always pointed out that mythology, the tales of the Knights of the Round Table, Beowulf, all the ancient mythologies were basically psychological guidance.
Mm-hmm.
They took the place of psychologists in a way, and they were there to teach people how to deal with problems in life. The Grail quest, that he talks extensively about how the questing for the Grail was really questing for enlightenment, questing for to meet demons, dragons, go into the darkest place in the forest and confront black knights who are going to try to stop you, maidens who are going to seduce you, the dragons and demons. And those stories were really about how we have to confront our own internal demons and dragons in order to move into our own enlightenment, our own space, our own self-awareness, better balance in our lives. I got to tell you, I'm very familiar with that, having gone through the experience of being an economic hitman and come out of it.
Right.
That was going into that darkest place. Now, when we look at Star Wars, for example, and these other shows that you mentioned and movies that are so popular today, a lot of them are really telling that same story, but it isn't so obvious to us. We're not brought up with that. In the old days, people were really brought up as the stories were told orally, as I've heard so many times with the Shwa and the Achwa and other Amazonian people. They sit around at night, and they all have similar types of legends that are there to guide them. And if you look at Star Wars, for example, Yoda is very clear where he's talking about going within. He's a meditator. He's a Buddha. And that message in Star Wars is very much about that. But we tend not to look at these stories as being about them. We tend to look at them as being the warrior. The people in the olden days could have looked at Sir Galahad and the other knights as just that, knights with swords who were out fighting evil and fighting other knights. But they understood that was really about the knight within them. And if we can understand that these forces that are being shown in these movies are really about how we can do that internally, that's an important one. But our media seem to have lost that. And I think, unfortunately, film is an easy place to lose that in, because it's so visual and audio, and it often misses the deeper meaning. So, but it's still there, that it's about that journey within, the hero's journey, and how we confront our own inner demons and dragons in order to move forward. And in that process, we also move our society and our culture forward. And this brings us to the second part of what you were just discussing, the politicians, where we are today. That, today these politicians are controlled by big corporations. Let's go, if we go back to right after 9/11, and the discussion about whether to attack Iraq or not, the largest demonstration ever on the Washington Mall occurred opposing us going into Iraq. It was bigger than the demonstrations in the Vietnam War. It's bigger than the I Have a Dream event with Martin Luther King Jr. It was huge, but it got very little press, and the Congress didn't listen to it. Our elected officials didn't listen to the people speaking, because they were listening to the big corporations who wanted war because they make a lot of money off war. Wall Street makes a lot of money off war. Raytheon and General Motors and General Dynamics and General Electric, they all make money off war. So the politicians were listening to that. And today, the same thing. We know that people in this country want better health care, but the politicians are really listening to those who make money off less health care for the normal people. And you can go on and on and on with this. You can talk to people across Texas where they're considering building a wall, and they'll all tell you they don't want a wall, that the wall won't do any good either. But there's this movement to build this wall because it's going to bring a lot of money for a lot of people. And then it takes on this element of the tweets and the sound bites and so on that become very rigged toward that. But we have to understand that all of this is driven by the big money. It's driven by Wall Street. It's driven by the big corporations, and they are dependent on you and your listeners and me ultimately. We have to speak out, and we've had tremendous success. Seatbelts, getting foods labeled as to whether they have how many calories they have, how many grams of protein, how many grams of fat, so on and so forth, on and on. We've had tremendous power. Now we need to ratchet this up a notch and say we want every corporation out there to be dedicated to creating a life economy, an economy that in itself is a sustainable resource, a renewable resource, And we're only going to patronize companies that are committed to moving in that direction. And it's up to all of us to make this happen. That's truly what democracy is.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I see it happening a lot, especially with my generation of people, like people in their 20s and early 30s. They seem to want to vote with their dollar more and kind of invest in things that are companies that are doing the right thing, being responsible and all that stuff. And so that's a good sign. I like that trend that's happening. But then you have this kind of massive machine with the corporations and government all in bed with each other, and they're still kind of functioning on that old model, and they're kind of plowing through. And we saw this with the Dakota Access Pipeline and the protests and the people there and the way that they were treated, and just the horrible stuff that was going on, the way that Indigenous people are treated. And it's this kind of, you call it the death economy, and it's like this broken window fallacy kind of thing, where it's like, all right, well, we're just going to build things, we're going to break things, then we're going to build things, and it's just like, that's not getting anybody anywhere. That's not serving humanity at all. And then, like you had mentioned, it becomes this kind of like circus sideshow that the media whips up and gets everybody involved in. And then sometimes we see things happen in places of the world where it really reaches a breaking point and it gets out of control. And recently we've seen this happen in Venezuela. Now, I don't really know exactly what has happened down there, but I was hoping maybe, I don't know if you have a clue into what that situation is like. But it seems like to me that it reached a breaking point recently, and the people are really upset, and they're in the street, and there's some things that are happening that's really bad. So could you elaborate on some of that? Do you know what's happening over there in Venezuela?
It's it's very complex. There must be amazing stories behind the stories that I'm not familiar with these days. But what I can say is that this goes back a long time. So in the 50s and the 60s and on, Venezuela was had the wealthiest and largest middle class in Latin America. It was phenomenal. It was all based on oil. So then the oil companies became very powerful, and the oil interests in Venezuela became very, very powerful. They had a president named Perez, who, as president of Venezuela, became the wealthiest, or at least one of the wealthiest, probably the wealthiest man in Latin America as president. Huge corruption.
Yeah.
And it was all around oil. Oil can cause huge problems for countries that have it, as we've seen time and time again. And then that eventually that led to Chavez, and Chavez was very charismatic. I think tried to do some good things, but he was a very lousy manager and caused a lot of problems. And now we got Maduro in there, who's not charismatic and continues to cause horrible problems. So it's a very deep-seated issue. But it all started because the people of Venezuela, this very well-off middle class, allowed the corporations, in this case it was primarily oil and all the corporations that revolve and spin off around oil, to take huge control and to essentially take over their government. We're seeing something like that now happening here in the United States, and we're seeing it throughout Europe. We're seeing all these austerity programs that are having such a huge impact on Greece and Italy and Spain and Portugal. It's because the very wealthy are allowed to run things, and we're certainly seeing it in the United States today. We need to stop it. Venezuela gives us a great lesson. They did it wrong, mainly because the people were prospering enough, the normal people, the middle class, that they felt comfortable. Well, just let things go. And let's face it, we in the United States and Europe, a lot of us are living pretty well. And even though we're in the process of destroying the planet we live on, this very fragile space station, we're living pretty well. So we say, okay, well, yeah, I don't like it very much, but what the heck, I'll just go to a movie tonight, turn on the television, and go out and have a nice dinner at a good restaurant or something or other. And I'm not putting, there's a lot of very, very poor people too. But the ones that tend to take the steering wheel in this country are pretty well off. We need to understand that we're not well off, that we're creating it, that we have a system and we're perpetuating a system that ultimately is a failed system. And it's showing us that on every level. We need to change it. We must not go the way of Venezuela, but we're headed in that direction unless we take active steps not to allow that to happen.
Right. And I think that you've done such a huge part in shining a light on what has happened, what you've been involved with, and exposing that, exposing that and sharing that with the people, informing the people, like Jefferson said, and we have to have an informed public, they have to be to be involved. So, with your first edition of Confessions of an Economic Hitman, that did that. That was that earth-shattering, eye-opening book, and then the new Confessions elaborates on that even more, which came out last year. And what I'm concerned, what I worry about, or what I'm interested in is, I think there's a lot of people out there, and the tide is turning. There's a lot of people waking up, but there's a lot of people still out there that look at maybe a book like that or look at something like that and say, no, that's not how the world works. Like, they don't have this belief that they kind of think that the world works in a different way, maybe in more of a fantasy way. And, maybe it's a way of kind of pushing it off so they don't have to deal with it, so they can, like you said, go turn on the TV or do something like that. But we might be running out of time where we hit a major crisis and a calamity, and it could be too late. So, for these kinds of people, the people that aren't really necessarily open to that, I mean, maybe could you share a little bit of kind of your kind of tips or advice on kind of communicating with people that maybe have given you a little bit of resistance and don't necessarily kind of believe that the world does indeed operate in this way?
Well, like, first of all, I'd say that we don't need to convince everybody.
Right. Right. Yeah,
I
that's
mean,
true. Yeah.
the critical mass. My advice to most people is pick the lowest fruit. And some people say, well, all you're doing is preaching to the choir. Maybe that's true, but the choir has to sing, and when the choir sings, things will happen.
Oh, nice. I like that.
Our best guess is that when the American Revolution finally happened, when the Declaration of Independence was signed, about 30% of the population in this country approved of that, and another 30% were totally opposed. They were called Tories or Loyalists, and another the other 40% basically didn't care. And that may be where we're at now. And I think it's people your people who are listening obviously are involved,
Mm-hmm.
and I would really encourage them to be active. I have a webinar that's coming up in a couple of weeks. It starts. It's a 4-part webinar on how to write a bestseller as an activist. As an activist, and to me that's very, very important. And incidentally, there's a few spaces left, and that we're restricting it to 24 participants. We want to keep it as a salon, a small group of people that are really dedicated. And I've got a feeling that maybe a couple of your listeners who might want to join, they can go to johnperkins.org. But I think what's really important here is for all of us to use our talents, whatever those are. As I mentioned earlier, if you're a writer, great, come to the webinar and write as an activist. If you're what you do, you follow your heart, your passion, you do these podcasts, carpenters, plumbers, teachers, whatever your profession is, dentists, doctors, we can all participate in this. And it's really important to get out there and take action and realize that not everybody's going to listen. And you don't need to spend a lot of time on some of those who are just totally intransigent, who their ways are set. That's always been the case, and that's okay. Let them go their way.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess a part of one of the biggest concerns I have is I love the work that you've done and with the indigenous cultures and continue to do, and I spent some time down in the Amazon rainforest as well in Peru, and it's just it's unbelievable when you spend time with the people down there, the indigenous tribes of the land, and you get to live in a way that they live, and it's really something totally different. And it's almost like if everyone could have that experience and do that, then we would have a lot more care for our planet and care for our fellow man and care for, the mystery and the connection of the cosmos and the wonder of it all. And we could actually live a better life. So one of the things that I really fight for and talk about a lot on this show is trying to put an end to the war on drugs and trying to try and change that and make a change. And I think we have come a long way in doing that. And I know that there's some countries out there that have given us some good models, like what Portugal is doing, and the decriminalization, and the work that's happening right now in the Amazon rainforest with the resurgence of this ancient brew called ayahuasca and shamanism coming back into the fold. And I really want to preserve the life down there, and the cultures down there, and the environment down there. So what are some good examples maybe that we can look at, that people can look at, other than the work that I know that you can plug the work that you're doing, of course, but obviously you're the guest on the show, so you are contributing to that. But what are some other places, like some countries or some companies or some people that are doing some big things that we could all look to and try and emulate in this country here, and as people here?
Well, I would like to really focus on what we're doing here. I mean, you can look at a lot of examples overseas, and like what's going on in places like Italy, and I mean, all the controversy that's going on in all over the world, the Brexit thing, what's the elections in France, Italy, Greece, Ireland, Iceland. I spend a lot of time in all these countries. I'm headed to Italy soon, and in Latin America, we're seeing things. But I think to really look here, as you mentioned earlier, people in your generation, like I do a lot of speaking at MBA programs and universities, and 10, 12 years ago, when I asked people what their goals were in business schools, they all said power and money, but they don't anymore. They now say that they want to have kids, and they understand that the world's falling apart. They want to create a better world for their kids. I mean, I'm hearing this a lot. So I think there's a huge worldwide movement. I think we're waking up across the planet. I think there's truly a consciousness movement. And the backlash of that is the turmoil that we've seen in our most recent presidential election here, and we're still experiencing in that, and also that we're seeing throughout Europe and so much of the world, and we're seeing it in Latin America, we're seeing it in Africa, we're seeing it all over. There's a backlash.
Right.
But the fact is, people truly are waking up to understand that we're living on a very fragile space station, and we're the navigators. We the people, and we're not doing a good job. We've got to change our navigation. We've got to navigate in new directions. I'd really like to leave people with this idea that I think we're living today. I think all of your listeners are so fortunate that we're living in the most blessed times. We're living in perhaps the greatest revolution that human beings have ever known, bigger than the industrial agricultural revolution, a consciousness revolution, where we're truly waking up to the role of human perception in molding the realities of this planet. And we're waking up to the fact that the realities we've molded are not life-supporting and are heading us toward disaster for ourselves, our children and grandchildren. And we need to change that perception and move in a new direction. And whether you're a writer or an artist or a musician or a dentist or a lawyer or a parent or whatever you are, this is the time to really take action. And I would only say that there's a lot of specific examples in the new Confessions of an Economic Human. I have long lists of things, a list that students can do, a list that retired people can do, and on and on. There's a whole strategy there, and a lot of it's on my website, johnperkins.org, and we'll be in my writers conference, writers webinar. But the short version of that is, if each and every one of us follows our deepest passion, whatever that is, and uses our best skills, we can all go on different paths, we can take different routes, but let's all head for the same destination of creating a life economy, transforming this death economy, this failing system, into a successful system, a life economy that is itself a renewable resource.
John Perkins, thank you so much, sir. New York Times bestselling author, activist, and chief economist, John Perkins, ladies and gentlemen. John, thank you so much. And please, I know you mentioned a couple of times, johnperkins.org is where people can find you. Just let the people know elsewhere where they can find you, and maybe any events and things that you have coming up.
Well, I'm on Facebook. Go to not my personal page, because that's not very active, but my fan page, where I am very active, and I'm on Twitter, And it all can start with johnperkins.org, dreamchange.org. Dreamchange, a nonprofit I found, is doing an amazing summit for business leaders. We're calling it the Love Summit. It's the second one we've done. The first was a huge success. We're getting business leaders to buy into this idea of loving a life economy, moving into that. This next one is going to be in Cincinnati, October 12th and 13th. You can go to dreamchange.org, johnperkins.org, and come with me on one of these trips to the shamans, to Colombia or Guatemala, the Amazon, or someplace, because those are phenomenal experiences. And Mike, I would just like to leave it with, you're doing great work here. Keep it up. And when you keep this work up and people like you and your listeners do what their passions tell them to do, and we will, for sure, create a life economy, a better world.
Excellent. Thank you so much, John. And I hope to join you on one of those ventures or meet up with you as soon as you're around in the area and everything. And I just want to thank you once again so much. Thank you for all the work that you do and for fighting the good fight that you do and traveling around and doing all this great stuff. And thanks for being on my podcast today, Mike Brancatelli, John. And I hope to talk to you soon.
You're welcome, Mike. I look forward to talking again. Bye-bye.
Take care. I hope you guys enjoyed that podcast as much as I did. You know what to do if you love this show. Share it, like it, spread it with your friends. Tell a friend, tell a family member, tell a neighbor, tell a coworker. And if you want to support the show, you can go to patreon.com/MikeBrank. You can donate as little as $1 a month. Or you could go on iTunes and leave me a nice 5-star rating and review. Whatever you do, thank you for listening. Much love to you all. Peace.